Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. My name is Ben Fitzsimmons. I am the Associate Director of Programs and Research at the Autry Museum of the American West. Before we begin our program, we always like to acknowledge that the Autry is on the ancestral lands of the Gabrielino Tongva and recognize them along with their neighbors, the Tataviam and Chumash, as the traditional caretakers of this land. Today's program features Dr. Rebecca Schofield as she discusses her book, Outriders, Rodeo at the Fringes of the American West, and how the International Gay Rodeo Association, whose archives reside at the Autry, navigated tense debates about the meaning of the cowboy from 1975 through today. Following a brief presentation, she will be in conversation with Josh Garrett-Davis, who is the Autry's Gamble Associate Curator of Western History and Popular Culture. Feel free to ask questions during that conversation using the Q&A button, and they'll try to address as many of those questions as possible during that conversation. For those of you who haven't seen it, the Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen. So we do also have a chat box for you to exchange thoughts with your fellow audience members if you so desire, but we do of course ask that all comments remain respectful. So today, Rebecca Schofield is an assistant professor of history at the University of Idaho, focusing on the history of gender and sexuality, popular culture, and the American West. Born and raised in Idaho, she is interested in how people enact popular ideas about the West in their everyday lives. She is principal investigator of the Gay Rodeo Oral History Project and co-creator of the web exhibit Voices of Gay Rodeo, gathering vital information about how gay men and women have built a vibrant community and experienced rodeo over the past 40 years. Her other work includes country western icons such as Dolly Parton and mechanical bull riding. So that must have been quite a fun experience to research that one. Her book, Outriders, Rodeo at the Fringes of the American West, analyzes various forms of rodeo, including gay rodeo and prison rodeo, in order to scrutinize narratives of authenticity in the popular performance of the American West. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, for those of you who haven't bought the book, it is available on the Autry's online store, which is shop.theautry.org. And I'll put that in the chat box. So enough from me. I will now hand it over and enjoy the program.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. It means so much to be able to talk to people about my research and sort of share what I've learned over the last about 10 years. So I'd like to first thank the Autry for allowing me to do this program. It was originally going to be in person and, for being flexible with our current pandemic and everything that's happening in our world. So I also wanted to thank the Autry for its sort of longer support of my research. As was mentioned, IGRA's, the International Gay Rodeo Association's institutional archive is at the Autry. And so many years ago when I was first starting this, I got to go to LA for the first time. And I worked with amazing people, Belinda Nakasato, let me stay at her house when I had to come back. Marva Felchun has been an absolute support. And then other people who have just been involved with the Autry over the years. Gregory Hinton has been just really important for me to gain access to these sources. And then I also want to just thank anyone in the International Gay Rodeo Association who has so kindly shared their stories with me and my team of students over the past 5 years. It's been really meaningful. So thank you for everyone who's here and anyone who's helped me on this journey. So before we start a discussion, I thought I would just introduce everyone to the book and kind of the larger ideas that I'm studying and talking about in the book at large. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen and introduce you to some of what I talk about in my book. So my book is called Outriders, Rodeo at the Fringes of the American West. And really, I kind of want to start make sure I can advance this line, sort of where we are right now. So over the past several weeks, as people are taking to the streets to demand racial justice, we see an outpouring of stories about young African-American people who are doing this through horseback riding and through cowboy performance. And a lot of these stories are very interesting to me because they are framed as, you know, the untold story of the Black cowboy, you know, the unknown history. Nobody knew these people existed, which is just untrue, right? Historians have been writing about Black cowboys for a long time. Black cowboys have known about Black cowboys for a long time. And for me, in my book, you know, I talk about this exact same phenomenon happening in the Black Power era, and that the cowboy is a really powerful symbol to demand equal rights in the United States. So I look through places like Oakland and Bowley that used Western performance in a straightforward sort of civil rights way. So with this happening right now, this is directly addressing the question that's at the center of my book, which is how have people over the 20th century used participation in rodeo to demand greater inclusion and to resist erasure from the narrative of the historical West. So I am a historian of performance and popular culture. And the West is a really great place to study performance and identity, because in the West, we had a region that was being mythologized even as it was being settled. You have people like Buffalo Bill Cody. And so for historians of the West, we are always studying the balance between the sort of mythology of the West and the reality of the West, and how those two things are inextricably combined. So one of my favorite scholars, Louis Warren, talks about studying the staged American West as a place that captures, quote, the personal cost of maintaining the illusion of a life lived in accordance with national myth. So my book really tried to focus on why is this an identity important to people, and how have they used their performances to sort of claim that belonging in the nation. So I'm interested particularly in rodeo, not just all Western performance, which is pretty broad, but rodeo in particular, because rodeo is very violent. It's a very violent sport and performance. So here we have an image from Kip Hinton that's called The Big Fall. And we see a young boy in 1960 falling off this steer bull. And he was okay. He did not win that day. Obviously, he fell off. Actually, a young girl won. But rodeo is a very dangerous sport. A recent study put professional football and professional hockey as less dangerous sports. I think rodeo had about 10 times the injury rate than professional football. So people are really willing to get hurt in order to participate in this, which means it is something that has meaning, and it's something to investigate. And also rodeo is a great place to look, to think about these things, because it produces a great deal of sources. Historians are always interested in how can we uncover people's feelings. So this is just a sample of the array of sources that was available to me: posters, magazine articles, buckles, pins, newspaper articles, along with board of directors meetings, rule books, contestant complaints, surveys, all sorts of other archival material. And then on top of this sort of source base, and this was just the sources available to me on my gay rodeo chapter, but I was also able to, with the help of IGRA and my university, and most recently the Whiting Foundation, I was able to actually start the Gay Rodeo Oral History Project, And with the Whiting Foundation's grant, we were able to train 6 of my university's students to travel to rodeos and actually speak with people who've been involved with the association over the years and gain their stories. This is just vital information that we are so happy to have. To actually, a lot of my historian friends don't actually get to talk to living people. So it's important to understand how people are understanding this history themselves and gain their perspective. So in my larger work, I actually talk about 4 different types of communities that have used rodeo. So my first chapter looks at early professional cowgirls, particularly Tilly Baldwin, who was a Norwegian immigrant. She dressed hair in Brooklyn before running away with the rodeo. She won many bronc championships all over the American and Canadian West in the 1910s and 20s. I also talk about the Texas Prison Rodeo, which ran from 1930 to 1985, and is a site where we can look at sort of performance and control. And it's particularly a vital place to talk about race and rodeo, because prison rodeo was one of the few places that Black cowboys could perform against white cowboys during the Jim Crow era. I also talk about the Black Power era and the late 60s, 70s with Black cowboy performance in Boley, Oklahoma and Oakland, California. And then I talk about sort of the roots of the International Gay Rodeo Association in Reagan's America in the 80s and early 90s. So that's the kind of broad overview of my book. At the center of it all is people I call Outriders. Now, historically, Outriders, like you see here, were people who existed at the margins of the cattle drive. They weren't the lead, the person sort of at the front of the cattle drive. They weren't completely behind, but they were on the sides. And it was their job to keep the cattle moving forward. And I thought this was a productive way to talk about how in so many spaces in American society, whether it's the NFL, rodeo, the military, all sorts of spaces, there are people who have both been marginalized, like literally pushed to the margins, but who are also absolutely vital for continuing those practices and those icons. And that it's a really interesting way to think about the sort of radical potential of Outriders to both rewrite those symbols, reclaim them, but also to understand some of the problematic dynamics that continue to persist over time. So today, I thought we would talk about the International Gay Rodeo Association during Pride Month, and I am also happy to answer any questions about other forms of rodeo if you have it. So thank you, and I can't wait to talk to Josh.
Hi there. I'm Josh Garrett-Davis, everybody, and I'm thrilled to get to have this conversation with Rebecca, both to learn more about what's behind our collections and to learn more about this vital topic that's part and parcel, totally tied in with what we do at the Autry. And so, Rebecca, I just wanted to ask first if you could just give us a basic thumbnail sketch of how the International Gay Rodeo Association came into being, and when and how and where and who did that.
Yeah, no problem. So gay rodeo is really interesting because first and foremost, it is an outgrowth of an already long established commitment by the LGBTQ community to their communities. So the first gay rodeo, all rodeo has a little bit gay, but the first official gay rodeo was in Reno. And it started because a man named Phil Ragsdale was part of the imperial court system. And the imperial court system dated back another decade or so, and it was sort of a drag competition or a royalty competition in which members of the community that were then tasked with raising money for their wider community. And so Phil Ragsdale thought that one productive thing to do in Reno would be to host a rodeo. So he put on that event. It was difficult to, for instance, have people rent them stock, but they managed to round up some wild stock, as they refer to it often. And, you know, had a couple hundred people come out, raise some money, had a good time. You know, within a couple of years, they're having 10,000 people. They have Joan Rivers presiding every year. And really what you see is a lot of people who had been operating under this sort of idea that the only way to be a successful LGBTQ person was to exist in the city and to sort of conform to one way of being. And a lot of people felt alienated by that. They came from rural places, or they just missed working with stock and being around animals and being around people who maybe didn't fit the stereotypes. And so you have a lot of interest starting to bubble up in other places like Colorado, Texas, California. And you have particularly, this is sort of emerging, right? Because we don't have cell phones, we don't have the internet. This is emerging around the gay bar scene. So you have places like Charlie's of Denver, where employees and people who hang out there are getting more involved and start to organize big contingents of, you know, busloads of people to go to the National Reno Gay Rodeo every year. So by the early 1980s, other places like Texas and Colorado start to organize their own rodeos. So in 1985, the International Gay Rodeo Association was created in order to create sort of an umbrella organization that would sanction rules, have standardization training of officials, and sort of making sure that there could be an actual circuit where people can go to multiple events. And it really coincided with sort of fortuitously within the larger culture, a big, what do I want to say, like Western wear boom. So you have the moment of the urban cowboy and cowboy chic. People are line dancing, mechanical bull riding, as I've written about, becomes really popular in this era because of ghillies and urban cowboy. And so it sort of converges with this moment where there's a lot of people looking for this. There aren't a ton of niche sort of gay-friendly activities to do. And a lot of people found a place they fit that they hadn't previously. So it grows very rapidly into the 90s. You know, they're up to between 5,000 and 8,000 people by the mid 90s, up to 20 rodeos, and then start to sort of see a slow decline over the following decades with like a couple of peaks around like Brokeback Mountain and the mid-aughts and things like that. So it really grew out of this moment when there's other hypermasculine subcultures, for instance, like it overlaps well with leather or bears, and then sort of grows into its own phenomenon where people who are, you know, define themselves as really country Western, find some place they can fit in.
Wow, it's fascinating. And of course, thinking about especially the 80s and 90s in LGBTQ history, and of course, thinking of our own moment, I can't help but think of the AIDS epidemic or a pandemic at that time and how these grew together in that time. And what do you see in the history that overlaps with that devastating time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the AIDS epidemic is essential to IGRA's history, particularly because they're a charitable organization. So I actually grabbed a quote out of one of my oral histories today that I want to read you. This is from a woman who joined the association very early on. I think she helped write the first rule book. And she said, Quote, when I first got started, they wanted me to run for Ms. TGRA, so Texas Gay Rodeo Association. And that's when the AIDS epidemic was coming out and everybody was scared to death and we couldn't get money. I didn't really want to do it because there was just so much work. I mean, you had to go to fundraisers every weekend. And I was just trying to make a living. I was just trying to survive. And then my friends started dying and I changed my mind. I said, what do I do? So I ran the first year that TGRA was formed. I ran and won Miss TGRA. I was doing it to raise money to find a cure for AIDS is what I was doing. A lot of the guys, all the people I rodeoed with back then, they aren't here anymore. They laugh at me for being a dinosaur, but I'm the only one that is still alive and it hurts my heart. You know that it took so many years for them to do something about it and to find a cure for AIDS and stop labeling it a gay disease because it wasn't. So a lot of people at the time, this was something they could do. It was something positive that they could do for their community. They could raise money either through the rodeo itself or through, you know, the dance competitions, the royalty competitions, everything that sort of went with this larger rodeo circuit to put back into their community. And when people talk about that moment as being so sort of seminal to this community, that this is where they found family and what sort of got them through, it is really heart-wrenching. And, you know, IGRA's circuit was, or the rodeos were postponed this year for the rest of the year. They made that decision back in May. And, you know, it was really hard. It was hard for me to tell my students that they wouldn't get to go to any more gay rodeos because we had been planning on being at 5 more this year. And it was really hard to tell them that that wasn't going to happen and to know that a lot of people out there are missing their rodeo families.
Mm-hmm. That are those deep friendships forged through like something just unfathomable. Yeah. So from the museum perspective, we always are sort of trying to think about what stories that material culture can and museum collection. So both, of course, there's it's kind of a split archive, or what do they call it? A mixed archive is what our archivists call it, that it includes 2D and 3D objects, right? And so that along with all of the business records and the programs, there are also the belt buckles you showed. Your source base includes belt buckles. We have some chaps and wranglers, and the posters are 2D, but they also are a sort of material culture. What do you think that we did you notice anything that you can understand differently or about IGRA history, thinking about the full range, not just the words that we historians like to quote, but the images and the 3D material culture?
Yeah, so obviously for me, one of my side interests is the fashion industry, and Western wear in general is so important. Dress in general is so important to history and to how people express their identities. And there's that multi-layered facet, right? So in the West, you know, Western wear, like that beautiful yoked shirt you're wearing, of course, would not have been worn in the 19th century. Was the
it wouldn't.
This was like created for the entertainment industry, right? By rodeo performers, by film stars, people who had to be, you know, noticed and often noticed like in faraway grandstands. So Western wear kind of brings together that really fun flashiness, the attention to detail, and sort of welds that with sort of practical ideas like snap buttons that can rip off if they get snagged dangerously or something like that. So Western wear is very much like a 20th century phenomenon. It's not sort of a historical look. I mean, even like jeans are created for miners, not for cowboys, all of those sorts of things. But over the 20th century, this has become what we think of as the cowboy. And, you know, so you already have some of that at play when you study rodeo in general, but then to go to the gay rodeo, which you know, the LGBTQ community is already so great at playing with the meanings of things, right? So a lot of the people I interview called what they were wearing their cowboy drag. And it is the self-conscious performance of, and at times playful over performance of an identity in order to sort of expose those cracks in the narrative, right? And so who do we consider a real cowboy? Ronald Reagan wore cowboy outfits a lot. Was he a real cowboy? How do we sort of push on that? And that's one thing that's really, I think, shocking to a lot of people who go to the gay rodeo. And this was true for me too, is I definitely had my stereotypes. Like when I heard there was a gay rodeo, I was like, it's gonna be fabulous and there's gonna be sequins everywhere. And like there's sequins, but they're not everywhere. And that's what the Autry's archive actually does really well, is it shows they're shaps. A lot of them are shaps. And that you would find, like, you would probably actually find a lot fancier of shaps on like a Brazilian bull rider on the PBR circuit. It speaks pretty deeply to the culture in terms of you know, the shirts that come in are pretty demure in their logos. They're starched. They sort of play to you know, Western wear. They are remarkable in some ways in their ordinariness, in the way that they sort of use the already established codes and modes of communication. And I love the belt buckles are so fascinating to look at, the iconography that's used. Same with, you know, the posters and the flyers. That's really, as a historian of popular culture, what I'm doing is going in and looking at you know, is the rainbow flag used very often? A lot of times not in promotions, partly because people don't want to be targeted for hate crimes. And so a lot of that promotional material needs to be coded and only use acronyms, not use the pride flag, those sorts of things. How has that changed over time? And so this is just a really great place to kind of delve into questions of performance, icons, and authenticity.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I was sort of like a little bit let down, like that the shirts are like one color, or, you know, it's like a one color snap button shirt. It's not like this. And at least the ones in our collection. I also want to encourage people to start putting things in the Q&A, because I think we can start answering some of the audience questions too, but we'll keep talking as you collect your thoughts and start sending them our way. But just continuing on that thread while we're waiting, I was curious about, like, the poster that you showed, for instance, it's like kind of beefcakey or what, I don't know how to describe it exactly, but then some of the other ones are very low key, as you say. It's only the initials, like, if you don't know, you don't know. And I don't know, did you see, is that a certain geographical difference, or is different across from the 80s to the 2000s, or what did you kind of observe in terms of trends there?
So unfortunately, there was a lot of hate directed at this association over time. And so very quickly, there has to be some coding that's done. So it actually in the rule book states, like, you cannot use anything but the acronym on what do I want to say, on newsletter outside. So someone's post carrier couldn't out them. You would see a lot more of the demure images. Also, the rhetoric that's used tends to be much more straight-laced if it is for a larger audience. If it is a press release that's going to go to the LA Times, it's going to look different than the internal newsletters, where people are a little bit more open in their communication style and what they're willing to say, in the iconography they use, all of those sorts of things. And I mean, even photography becomes a really big issue in the association of who's allowed to take pictures. So early on, people might have worn armbands to say, like, please don't take my picture, because there were various levels of being out. And unfortunately, I mean, it was really necessary because, you know, I think it was in the 1988 finals in Nevada were canceled because the town deemed it a public health issue, which was obviously like code for AIDS, but they said it was because of the dust that was going to be created. And so when rodeoers arrived at this, you know, at the grounds that they had paid to use, there was a large sign that said, like, you are being videotaped, you need to leave town immediately. And they, you know, tried to fight it in court really quickly, but, you know, the injunction passed. And so all of that money was gone, people's time, people's effort, and it was, you know, it's just devastating. And so I think there's two sort of things going on with the iconography. One is that they had to tone it down in some ways, but then I also think that in particular this community draws people that some of them, I think, sort of eschew some of the louder, more flamboyant forms of performance, and they just want to hang out with people, you know, that they call like regular guys, you know, people who have a different performance of gaiety, of joy, of being LGBTQ, and so it's kind of the balance there, with different things happening over different times. I will say, I did not really like trace a sort of one-to-one, but any forms of internal communication, right? Anything that's going to go in the gay rodeo program, things that are going to go to certain bars, those would tend to be very beefcakey. And very hyper masculine. There is, particularly in the early association, at least what has survived to the archive, is quite focused on hyper masculinity. And sometimes women were represented, but, you know, to a lesser degree, even though they did make up a good portion of the association, and especially the leadership. So it's interesting to see where the beefcakery pops up the rest of the time. It is a pretty, like, you could be looking at any rodeo flyer.
Right. Yeah, I noticed that as well. Here we have a question from Megan Maloney that kind of follows on as up to the present day of where do Orville Peck and Lil Nas X kind of performing versions of cowboy fashion today, queer cowboy fashion in a way today, fit into this lineage?
Yeah, so I actually wrote a post on Cowboys have always been gay and black, so Lil Nas X is in very good company. So the Yeehaw agenda is just gives me life. So I mean, I think that this is, so I'm sorry, I could talk about this for a very long time, so I'll try to be super direct. So particularly in cowboy fashion, you have the kind of flashy, Hollywood early rodeo fashion that comes out. And then once sort of what's referred to as ranch wear starts being produced, like rock mount shirts start being sort of mass produced, sold at, D&Bs everywhere, like Tractor Supply stores everywhere. There is a push in the sort of 60s and 70s to make, what people called at the time, more authentic Western wear, right? We want flannels. We don't want hyper embroidered yokes. We want it toned down a little bit. And, I write on Ralph Lauren a lot. He is just, I mean, I don't need to share my personal opinion about Ralph Lauren, but the way he talks about Western wear is he discovered it. I have created prairie dresses, and that is the real Western wear. And he literally says it's not nudies, right? It's not nudies of Hollywood. It's not this overly flashy, tacky, you know, Dolly Parton, Grand Ole Opry form of Western wear. It's something new but authentic, and I found it, right? And so then the sort of louder forms of Western wear sort of fall out of fashion in kind of mainstream consumption, but certainly not in sort of Black rodeo circuits, certainly not for people of color who are still using these sort of really amazing sartorial expressions of cowboyness and sort of hanging on to that particular mode of communication. And now we sort of see this resurgence, right? And I think Lil Nas X was perfectly poised to do this because he is already so heavily questioned about his realness. Like, is it really country music if, you know, if you use this beat that you bought? Like, if it was popularized on TikTok, can it possibly be real country, right? And so, and then of course, he's Black, so he's already getting that pushback, and then he comes out as gay, he's getting that pushback. And so his flamboyancy amidst the sort of larger Black performance of the cowboy was so perfectly situated and really sort of calls back to, like, if you want to be really honest about like what real Western wear is, like, it was created for showmanship. It was created to draw the eye. So more than like a flannel rock mount shirt from 1950s, it's going to be like a heavily embroidered yoke from like a, you know, cowboy performer in the 1920s. So yeah.
Following up on that, from Flannery Burke, we have the question of, could you talk about race within gay rodeo, specifically non-white, whether African-American or Latinx or other Native American rodeo performers? Was there any presence there?
Yeah, so absolutely. So I would say, based on my personal experience, that it's predominantly white. And, you know, we have interviews with Native people, we have interviews with Filipino American rodeoers, with Laotian, American cowboys, but it is predominantly white. And part of that is the sort of classed nature of the LGBTQ community at this time. As anyone in gay rodeo will tell you, it is incredibly expensive to participate in. It is so expensive to participate in because, especially if you're a woman, because while anyone can do any event at gay rodeo, they're still separated by men and women. So what ends up happening is almost always there's fewer women who enter into a category, and so they make less purse money because it's based on who, even if they post better scores than the male side. So so it's very expensive to participate in. It's an amateur circuit. There's not a lot of money to begin with, not huge sponsorships, all of those things. And then these are also very far away from each other, right? You have rodeos that are, the circuit is massive, right? Whereas like in Idaho, if you're a cowboy, you could probably hit 20 rodeos, mainstream rodeos in the state, right? And you could do that by driving. This is, you know, you're in Palm Springs one weekend, Oklahoma the next weekend, Alberta the next weekend. And so it's very hard for people to be able to afford to do this, and it really takes a lot of money. And so what ends up happening is it is a predominantly white male place. And the people I've talked to have, you know, repeatedly said that they try to be opening and welcoming, but there is still a sort of sense that, like, well, Black people just don't rodeo. And I'm like, that's
another chapter.
That's a whole other chapter that they actually do. And so there's a lot of like, well, we don't know what we're doing wrong necessarily. Like, we don't know why we're not attracting these people. And that is, yeah, I would say it's predominantly white, predominantly male, not totally, but it also feels like a very sort of hyper-masculine white male space at times.
Mm-hmm. For contrast, we have a sort of question from Dr. Sydney Freeman about asking about the Black Gay Rodeo in Oakland. But I think in your book it's actually not. It's a Black rodeo in Oakland, right, and not a Black Gay Rodeo in Oakland, right? Yeah. But can you just tell a little of that backstory to fill us in?
Yeah. So so the Oakland Black Cowboys Association has run since the late 70s. So essentially, in a moment of Black Power, in the Black Power era, where Oakland in particular is trying to find icons, right, to teach in their schools and make sure that you know, young Black children are being exposed to their own history. The one of the history museums in town put on a sort of Black settler display and an exhibit, and it had such an outpouring of interest that a sort of group of businessmen and sort of civically minded businessmen sort of invested in a parade every year. And so there would be the Black Cowboy Parade every year. It still happens in Oakland. And they formed the Black Cowboy, I think it's the Black Cowboy Association of America now, out of Oakland. And it's really interesting because, you know, I was looking at archives that is like a teaching packet to go into Oakland schools, and it lists like the Black Panthers alongside like Bill Pickett and sort of famous Black cowboys. And a lot of that sort of happened. My longer chapter looks at rural places like Bowlee that had used Western performance and its sort of settler roots to talk about civil rights pretty productively. And then as a lot of people had to sort of leave, I mean, the amount of land loss for African Americans post World War II is astronomical. And it's just, I mean, it's just systemic racism, right? Like you can just see the way in which land agents, banks, everyone pushed people of color off the land and into cities, and particularly places like Oakland that had a strong war industries for people. So Oakland sort of used the cowboy to talk about particularly Black masculinity. And what I sort of look at sort of gets very tense in this is the way it relates to Native histories, particularly in Oklahoma, where some people arrived in Indian territory as enslaved people in the 19th century, and then other Black settlers came as squatters on Native land at the end of the 19th century, and how those three groups of people, and of course mixed race, Afro, particularly Afro Creeks in this instance, how they kind of negotiated that within these performances, and what kind of gets left out in places. And I also sort of talk about how Bowlee, Oklahoma is always talking about like, they're about to boom, they're about to boom, they're about to boom again. And like America's going to notice the Black cowboy any moment now. I find that very interesting, seeing that America is once again discovering that we have Black cowboys. And I should note that, like, just in case you don't know, like most people working as ranch hands in the 19th century, you know, this was not the idealized cowboy we now know, right? They were working class, they were homosocial, they were nomadic, and it was a large portion people of color, whether vaqueros, whether Native people, and African American, often enslaved, or like newly freed enslaved people working the cattle trails from Texas to Kansas. So they've always been there.
Yeah. So we have a question from Carolyn Brucken. How did the Oral History Project expand or add to what you were able to learn from the archives?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I feel like I wanted to do oral histories when I was a grad student, and I didn't have the financial support. So I was very lucky to get a job and then be able to get grant support to do that. And so for me, a lot of my dissertation, I think I'd been to like 1 or 2 rodeos at the dissertation stage, and then I was able to go to many more rodeos for the book. And for me, it just added a lot of texture. I would say a lot of sort of what I understood about the rodeo from the archives. I wouldn't say there was things that I was like super wrong about, but the level of sort of beautifulness, right? the level of just, you know, gorgeous humanity that are these people. Like the first rodeo I went to, I was in Santa Fe and I walked to it like 2 miles in the blazing sun down like a highway with like my backpack because I was living in Boston. I forgot, like in the West, like you don't like walk down a highway to a rodeo's grounds and then sit in the sun for 12 hours and then like think you're gonna walk back. And like some cowgirls were just like, dude, where are you going? I was like, my hotel, it's several miles away. And they just took me to my hotel. So I wasn't like struck by a car going down the highway. So this is, I mean, we have just worked with, you know, the archives committee, Roger Bergman, Patrick Terry, Frank Harold, these people that just embody the humanity of this and give so much of themselves to keep this association going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember also like seeing that the pictures of the displays that Roger sets up at, you know, there's a lot of stuff that's at the Autry and there's a lot of stuff that they still haven't, not in the Autry, and does amazing public history kind of displays at the rodeos.
Yeah, and also just like the support they've given the oral history project. I mean, my students, you know, I had some undergrads, I had some PhD students. They were pretty nervous to go to convention, and they showed up, and Patrick Terry and Frank Harold like met them and talked to them and explained the association and had a table set up. I mean, it's just really helpful humans who are invested in protecting their own history, which is very rare. I mean, if particularly if Patrick hadn't just like kept a file of everything prior to being at the Autry, this archive was kept in the basement of Charlie's, like off the drag queen dressing room, and could have very, you know, easily not have happened if somebody was too busy. So they've been very careful about collecting their own history and then curating that and being open and trying to educate the public about it. And then also, as you said, at the rodeos, Roger, like, keeps anyone who's coming to the rodeo, they're learning about that history too.
And apparently they're occasionally bringing more stuff to him. I think people, yeah, I also want to mention the, if people want to learn more, one way is Becca's book, but I just did with Christina Hummel-Kola from our Library and Archives, did a blog post, and it has links to the, about with some of the posters from the 90s that we had digitized recently, but there are links to the Voices of Gay Rodeo site that Rebecca put up, and to the Gay Rodeo History site that Patrick and folks from the IGRA keep up, and then as well to your book and maybe to one other place. But just to take a look at that, if people want to learn more, you can find it on Autry's website. So Laura Lovelace asks, are there different events at a gay rodeo than a traditional rodeo? If so, what are they?
Yeah, that's something I always forget to talk about. I apologize, like what distinguishes a gay rodeo from mainstream rodeo. So first of all, I always talk about it in terms of like events and people. So the first thing is that you don't have to be gay to go to a gay rodeo. You just can't be prejudiced. You need to be accepting. At a gay rodeo, the 3 events that set it aside from others is really actually pretty it's very unique, but also very usual in that most small town rodeos will have what are called like local events, right? So these would be like chuck wagon races or wild cow milking or those sorts of things that aren't necessarily sanctioned by the PRCA, the Professional Rodeo Cowboy Association, but things that people still do at rodeos all over America. And so what IGRA did was sort of put a new spin on this. So they have 3 what are called camp events. Goat dressing, where you put a pair of briefs on a goat. It's a race. You have to do it with a partner. Steer deco, where you are again on a team and one person tries to hold the steer while another person ties a ribbon on their tail, which actually was a pretty popular local event throughout the 20th century. And then the wild drag race, which is really interesting in terms of performance and things. So that's a team of 3 people, and one person has to be in drag, though there's a lot of debate about what that looks like. I hear at convention this year, it was debated about like what counts as a skirt, you know, how long does the wig, you know, like what really constitutes quote unquote dressing like a woman in drag. And it's always female drag, whether the drag is identifies as male or female, you're always going to be in a wig and a skirt. So there's like some interesting things there. So those are the 3 camp events. Other than that, there's like other rodeos, there's speed events, barrels and poles and flags, rough stock events, broncs and bulls. And then I think no, there's something else. Anyways.
Yeah, no.
I think it's
been a while. You can't go to.
I know, right? I haven't been in this grandstands in a bit. But yeah, most of the other events you would find. And then the other big thing, as I said, is that there's male and, roping events, of course, speed roping, rough stock. So a male or female can, or however you identify, can compete in anything, but they are still sort of separated based on self-identification. And it is important to note that like IGRA has sort of taken to heart a lot of the criticisms about the harshness with which like calves are handled. So they only do breakaway roping and they do shoot dogging instead of bulldogging. So you wrestle a steer like right out of the chute on foot instead of like dropping from a moving horse onto a steer and wrestling it. So there's been some modifications, and they have veterinarians on call. They have to be at the rodeo grounds. But there is like a lot of human injuries too. You know, I think like just in our project, I've heard about like ears being torn off, ruptured spleens, broken ribs, broken collarbones, broken femurs, eyes being lost. It is still a very difficult and dangerous sport.
This kind of follows on that. Francis Young asks, are there LGBT cowboys who compete in both the gay and mainstream rodeos using their real names? Yes.
Yes. Well, so yes, absolutely. I don't know how much they use their real names, or so to my knowledge, there are not any PRCA or PBR, any of the major national circuits in which somebody has publicly announced that they identify as gay in the way that we've seen happening in the NFL and other professional sports. However, there's a lot of people on the gay rodeo circuit who do either compete in like local jackpots or they're with the American Quarter Horse Association and do shows, do dressage, do lots of other equestrian events. And I assume under their own names, but I'm not certain what the kind of level of amateur versus professional there are.
Okay. And finally, it's pretty good timing, I think. It's been almost an hour here. What is your favorite piece of IGRA material culture that you came across, and what appeals to you about it, or what did you learn from it? This is from Allison Roy.
It's really hard. Well, so we're going to talk about a piece of material culture that is not actually in the archive because it was on a living human. So first of all, anyone who has a chance to see the royalty sashes should, because they're all, they have brooches that people give them throughout the circuit, and so they're stunning. But in particular, my favorite sort of piece of material culture was on she was the Miss New Mexico Gay Rodeo Association. So her name was Marie Antoinette DuBarry, and her drag persona was very sort of took in the court of Louis XVI, and was very over the top. But what she would do is she would stitch in sort of Western motifs and particularly Mexican motifs onto her dresses. And we had just this amazing conversation about how, over time, this idea of what is Western wear, what is a cowboy, or what is Westernness has been narrowed down to a kind of uniform of like Wranglers and starched shirt and cowboy hat. And she was very resistant to that. She's like, I am from Santa Fe. That is the end of the trail. And we had people from France and from Spain and from Mexico and Native people and Chinese people and Anglo-Americans. And it was this real borderlands. And that she could sort of use her sartorial resistance in IGRA to remind people that this is really a borderlands history, and I loved that her whole performance, and that is so much of what I try to teach in my U.S. Western classes, that it isn't this sort of frontier narrative. There isn't like a line of like white humans moving across the West that like bring civilization, that it is instead a multicultural, multilingual, multi-religious borderlands where a lot of these identities are being negotiated and resisted and changed. So it was a very big treat to meet her and see some of her fashion.
Here. If you talk to her and she's looking for a home, I might know a museum for those pieces. Sound pretty amazing. One more question did pop up. Joy Garlington asks, are there any documentaries on gay rodeo?
There are. There are. I think there's several. I'm like completely blanking right now. Oh no!
There was one called, what is it? A straight year on the gay rodeo drag.
But I can't remember what the thing before the colon is.
Yeah.
But yeah, after the colon it's like a straight year on the gay rodeo, rainbow rodeo. Somebody just, I think, wrote that. And there is a documentary being made right now about the National Reno Gay Rodeo, sort of the iteration previous to the International Gay Rodeo Association. So I think there's people working on that. I actually sometimes get like really stressy around documentaries and stuff, because it's just like, oh no, I've lost that. Did somebody, Queens and Cowboys.
Queens and Cowboys.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think we just did a screening of that here. So there's some good stuff out there. There's also really good news coverage. I think Lisa Ling did a piece on gay rodeo, and there's lots of good information out there beyond just the massive amount of archival information that
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you to the Arizona Historical Society for coming through for us on some, and there's a place to belong. Place to belong.
Oh.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming through for us with the references. Ben, is there any sort of parting words? Do we need to wrap this up in some poetic way? I've learned a lot. I've loved hearing your take on it. And thank you so much for sharing this. I'm sorry you didn't get to bring your kids to Disneyland, and also to the Autry, but it was really great to see you on the video.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for everyone who took the time to come, and thank you for being a part of this community.
Yes, thank you everybody, and do check out the blog post on the website that Josh mentioned. It is in the chat bar, and for those interested in Black Rodeo, there is actually a film available now on the Autry website. We're streaming titled Bull, which is about a black bull rider in contemporary Houston. It's a very interesting film, so do take a look at that as well. Thank you.
There's a question that came up that I didn't see in the chat. That how much of the IGRA archives will be displayed, and will it always be displayed? To the Autry. Currently in our exhibition on Griffith Park, there's some artifacts from the Golden State Gay Rodeo that was held at the Equestrian Center in Los Angeles. And I've been working myself on renovating planning the renovation of our it's called the Imagination Gallery currently, but we are definitely planning to include presence of the IGRA archives there as one of a major voice in sort of creating and recreating what we know of as the West. I know it's been a long time since the donation came in. We've been we've been working. I mean, I've only been here 4.5 years, but we move very slowly in terms of getting things on display, but it is definitely happening, and it's definitely a collection that we value tremendously at the Autry. So I just wanted to address that. And I think that's it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Josh, and thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening, and we'll see you at the Autry in the future.
All right, thanks.